I mean, how did we make it to the year 2000 without those regulations? And then go back another 10 years. Look at all the rules and regulations that were passed in the 1990s. The country was here in the 1980s. In fact, the further back in time you go, the more prosperous we were. And the reason is because we had fewer rules and regulations. We had more freedom. The reason America became so rich is because we were the freest country in the world. But every time they pass another law, we lose a little bit of freedom. And as we become less free, as we have more government obstacles in our way that we have to overcome, it's harder to succeed. You know, we're one of the most heavily taxed and heavily regulated countries on the face of the earth. That's the problem. When we became rich, we were the least taxed and the least regulated. When my grandparents came here, my grandmother and grandfather on my father's side came to Connecticut about 100 years ago, they didn't have any income taxes to pay. They didn't have any. There was no federal income tax. There was no state income tax. They didn't have any Social Security taxes to pay. They probably paid, there was only taxes they paid were maybe some tariffs. They were tiny. All three, the federal, state, and local governments combined, all combined, didn't even take 5% of our GDP. And that's how come my grandfather was able to succeed. He started a small carpenter business. He never employed more than a couple of people, but he never kept any records. He didn't have to pay. There was no withholding taxes, no payroll taxes, unemployment compensation, none of that. You know, he just paid him cash. And as long as there was money left over, he figured he was doing a good job. It was easy to succeed. My grandmother never worked. My grandfather had 8 kids, you know, as a carpenter. My grandmother did work. They had a house. They had a vacation house. They had a car. You know, they had no credit card debt. We had the entire Industrial Revolution before my grandfather came in 1880. None of these taxes were here. Now, I mean, how can anybody make ends meet? Can a high school, not even a high school educated man, you know, working with his hands, can he support 8 kids and a wife without any debt? You know, the reason we can't do that today is because the government is so huge. There are other countries around the world where there's a lot more economic freedom than there is in the United States. That's why their economies are growing faster than ours. That's why their standards of living are rising. And so what we need to do is we need to recreate the economic conditions that existed before the government grew so large. And the problem now is we have a movement in Washington to move so rapidly and radically to the left because the government has succeeded in blaming the economic events of 2008 on capitalism, on free markets. And the public now, at least some of the public or politicians, accept the idea that what we need is more government control, more central planning. We need Washington deciding which businesses should succeed and which businesses should fail. Energy policy should come from Washington. Healthcare should be decided in Washington. Mortgages and banking should be done from Washington. That is the exact wrong thing that we want to do. The more decisions that we make by bureaucrats, the more bad decisions that we're going to make, because there's no real checks and balances. We need the market making these decisions. Because in the free market, if a businessman is doing something wrong, he goes out of business. He stops doing it. The market puts an end to it because he's losing money. But if a businessman is doing something right, if he's producing something efficiently that consumers want to buy, he's rewarded with profits. And then that business grows. And so the economy grows because what you're doing right gets rewarded, and what you're doing wrong, well, it stops. But in the opposite, the government, if the government does something bad, they just do it bigger because there's no check on it. If they're losing money, they just raise taxes, you know, or they go into debt. And all of these decisions are not made for economic reasons. They're made for political reasons. They're made because they get votes. Well, we don't want resources allocated because they get votes. We want things done efficiently. We want resources allocated based on profits, because a profit is a signal if you're doing it right, and a loss is a signal if you're doing it wrong. Yet what's the government doing? When companies lose money, they bail them out so they can lose even more. Why do we want to do that? It's like a reverse Darwinism. You know, we want the market to put an end to money-losing companies so that activity can end, and so that the resources that they use can be freed up to do something else. Now, we said we want to preserve jobs. Why do we want to preserve jobs that produce losses? It's better to free up the labor to do something that we actually need, that will actually benefit the economy. You know, everybody in the old Soviet Union had a job. There was no unemployment. But nobody had any purchasing power, because it didn't matter how much you worked. Nobody produced anything. So there was nothing to buy. What good is it to have a job if you don't have any stuff? You know, the key is to be employed productively. You know, when they say, well, we're going to stimulate the economy with government spending. The Soviet Union, that's all they did, is stimulus. The government spent everything. They printed endless amounts of rubles. But it didn't do anything. You know what stimulated the Soviet Union? When the whole country collapsed. When the government stopped stimulating, that's when the economies finally started to grow, because the government wasn't getting in their way. The same thing in China. You know, communist China didn't go anywhere until they dismantled the communist structure within their economy. They're still a communist country, but they're capitalist as far as the market is concerned. There's private property in China, and the average Chinese citizen, if he wants to start a business, it's a lot easier to do it in China than it is here. The regulations are fewer, the taxes are lower. There's tremendous entrepreneurship in China, and capital formation and economic growth. That's because the government got out of the way. And here, we're doing the opposite. You know, we're making the government bigger. They say, oh, we need to stimulate the economy. We need more borrowing. We need more spending. How can anybody look at the American economy and say, yeah, there's not enough spending? You know, we spent until we couldn't. Americans own so much stuff. We're deep in debt from all the stuff that we already bought. How can anybody say we need to spend more money? What we don't have are savings. The average American has less than $10,000 for retirement. That means they have nothing for retirement. So that's what we need. We need savings. We're not making stuff anymore. Why? Because the businesses don't have the capital. Well, because there's no savings. So we need to restore our savings, and we need to bring back our industries. We don't need to buy more stuff. We can stay out of the malls for years. You know, we got so much stuff. What we don't have is savings and production. We need more exports, right? We don't need to make more. Look at automobiles. How many Americans have 2 or 3 cars already? There are plenty of Chinese that are still on bicycles. They're the ones that need cars, and they actually have the money to pay for them. Why don't we make some cars and export them over there? You know, so that we can get out of debt. But we're not going to do any of this as long as the government is in the way, and that's what the stimulus is. And what I think is going to happen, and I'll take some questions if anybody has any for me about policies or anything, but what I think is going to happen in the next year or two is that we're going to have a Greek-style sovereign debt crisis in the U.S. That the bubble that we blew up in the 1990s was a stock market bubble. A lot of the cheap money that the Fed created went into the stock market, went into the dot-coms. When that bubble burst, the money went into housing, and then we had a real estate bubble. And when that money burst, now the Federal Reserve is inflating a bigger bubble, but this time in government. And it's the government that is growing dramatically in size. And the problem is that, at least in the dot-com bubble, or in the tech bubble, we did get some decent companies out of it. Sure, we overpaid for a lot of them, and we blew some money, but at the end of the day, at least we got something to show for it. There are some decent companies that came out of that era. And, you know, we certainly got a lot of technology out of it. I mean, we're all benefiting from the internet and things like that. So it wasn't a complete waste. Same thing in the housing bubble. We got a lot of houses. I mean, there's a lot of beautiful houses that were built. Yeah, we can't afford a lot of them, but they're there now. You know? I mean, people can at least live in them, right? I mean, they have value. It's better than people. We have a lot of homeless people. Why? There's so many empty homes. So why can't they move in? The government just let housing prices come down. A lot more people would move into these houses. But we got something to show for it. What are we going to have to show for the government bubble? Nothing. You know, all we're going to have is a bigger government and more debt. And that means that we're less likely to pay it back because the government is getting in our way. All of the resources that the economy needs to grow are being taken away by government and sent over to Washington. That's where all the economic growth is. It's in Washington, D.C. Because it's like a giant parasite living off the rest of the country. And the bigger the parasite gets, you know, the sicker the host gets. So what's going to happen is the funding of this government bubble is all this debt that we're issuing. And at some point, nobody is going to want to loan us money anymore. And that's when the real trouble begins. You know, Bernie Madoff, you know, he had no problems until people wanted their money back. Everything was great as long as nobody wanted their money. But the minute people asked Bernie for their money, that's when he had to confess that it was a Ponzi scheme. That's what the U.S. government is doing. We're borrowing all this money, but the only reason we can keep borrowing is because we can keep going deeper into debt. But the minute some of our creditors want their money back, we don't have it. Right? We have to default. Also, the only reason we're able to pay the interest on the national debt is because it's so low. You know, the interest rates are at 0%. The government is borrowing with Treasury bills. So we've got $13 trillion in direct bonded debt, but it's only costing us about $400 billion a year